The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of conversation as Tanya walked to the stand, her black heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She had done this many times before, but never for a case like this. Today was different. She felt the weight of the eyes on her. As she stepped up, her palms felt clammy as she adjusted her posture and took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She looked around the room at the sea of strangers and felt a pang of discomfort. She had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure, but today was different. The judge was a man who seemed as though he had spent his life behind that bench. His face was hard and etched with years of experience. Tanya could feel his gaze on her, even as he focused on the file in front of him, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He was busy scribbling something down without looking up for even a second. Tanya knew that this was his domain, and she was just another case to him to be processed and dismissed as quickly as possible. She straightened her back and stood tall, determined not to let him see the tension in her muscles. The room quieted as Judge Reynolds cleared his throat and raised his head, finally making eye contact with her. His expression was unreadable, his voice deep and commanding as he addressed her. "Miss Thompson, you are here today for a violation of traffic laws. I trust you have an explanation for this." His words were blunt and without any hint of curiosity. Tanya opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. For a second her heart skipped a beat, but she pushed the panic aside and began, "Your Honor, I was rushing to an urgent appointment. I didn't realize I had exceeded the speed limit until I was pulled over." She paused for a moment before continuing, "It was a mistake, and I apologize for the inconvenience." Her voice remained steady, even though she could feel her stomach knotting in anticipation of his response. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the papers in front of him and then back up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as though judging her sincerity. Tanya shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure if she had said the right thing or if it even mattered. The judge looked at her like she was just another case, a faceless person to be dealt with quickly and efficiently, as though her story didn't matter at all. Without missing a beat, Judge Reynolds lifted his gavel and gave it a quick rap against the desk, signaling the end of her chance to speak. "The law is the law, Miss Thompson, and in this case, the law must be upheld. You will be fined the standard amount for this violation." His words were final and without any emotion. Tanya felt the words hit her like a slap to the face. She hadn't expected mercy, but she had hoped for a moment of understanding, just the slightest acknowledgement that she wasn't just another speeding driver, that her story mattered even just a little. But now that hope faded away. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, her breath shallow, but she swallowed the frustration. She had spent years learning how to suppress her anger in moments like this, and now was no different. The judge's gavel struck the wood with authority, his decision made, as if she hadn't even spoken. Tanya stood there, her face a mask of composure, but inside she was seething. The fine was the least of her worries. What stung the most was the way he had dismissed her so quickly, as though she were invisible. It wasn't just a parking ticket or a speeding fine. This was a moment where her dignity had been overlooked, and she hated that feeling more than anything. As Tanya stood there in the silence that followed the judge's final decision, she could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her. The murmurs of the audience faded into the background as she struggled to hold her composure. She had expected to feel the sting of the fine, but what she hadn't prepared for was the overwhelming sense of invisibility that came with it. She had spent years working to make a name for herself, to prove her worth, but here she was reduced to a mere name on a piece of paper, just another traffic violation to be dealt with quickly and efficiently. Her thoughts raced as the judge began to move on to the next case, his disinterest in her situation clear as day. Tanya remained standing still for a moment longer, as if she were waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to notice. The silence in the room stretched out, and she felt herself shrinking under the weight of it. She had hoped for a glimmer of recognition, something that would show she wasn't just a face in the crowd, but the judge's quick decision made her realize that this wasn't going to be the moment. She had imagined the moment where someone would see her as more than just a circumstance. A court officer approached her, gently interrupting her train of thought, his footsteps quick and decisive, As he moved to hand her a thick envelope, Tanya blinked at the sudden distraction, still not quite able to process what had just happened. She stared at the envelope for a second. Before taking it from his hands, the officer gave her a nod. Before turning back to his station, Tanya held the envelope for a moment, not understanding what it was or why it had been handed to her at this precise moment. The officer had been brief and unceremonious, as if he were delivering a routine message. But something about the way he had handed her the envelope felt different, like a shift had taken place without her realizing. The judge had just called for a break in proceedings, and everyone in the courtroom shifted in their seats as some stood to stretch, others whispered quietly amongst themselves. Tanya glanced down at the envelope still in her hands. The curiosity that had been bubbling under her frustration began to rise to the surface. She ripped it open quickly, scanning the contents inside her fingers, trembling slightly as she read the words printed on the paper. The letters on the page were foreign to her at first, but as she absorbed them, her heart began to race, her breath catching in her chest. The documents inside weren't what she had expected. They weren't anything related to the case. They were her credentials, the ones that identified her as someone completely different, someone important. The words NASA stood out at the top of the page. Tanya could barely believe what she was reading. She blinked and looked again, her mind racing to understand the significance of it all. It wasn't just a parking ticket or a speeding violation. She was someone more than that. She was someone with a legacy, someone who had trained for years to reach the stars. Her identity was there in black and white, and in that moment she knew that the judge had no idea who he was dealing with, no idea that the woman standing before him was more than just an ordinary citizen. Her heart pounded as the realization began to sink in. She wasn't just a woman being dismissed. She was an astronaut, and she had been dismissed without a second thought for something as trivial as a speeding ticket. Tanya stood frozen in the center of the courtroom, her thoughts spinning, but her face remained composed. She didn't want to make a scene or cause a disruption. But in that instant she knew something had to change. This was no longer about a fine or a ticket. This was about showing the world that she was more than the labels they placed on her, that she wouldn't be overlooked or dismissed so easily. The weight of Tanya's revelation pressed down on her shoulders as she stood in the courtroom holding the envelope. Her fingers gripped it tightly, as if to steady herself against the sudden rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She glanced toward the judge, who was still busy reviewing other cases. But his words seemed so far away now. They were a distant echo from a time before she knew her identity had been overlooked so completely. She thought about walking out, leaving the courtroom behind, as if nothing had happened. But the thought of being dismissed without being seen made her chest tighten. She couldn't just leave, not now. Not after everything she had worked for. Her breath was steady, but the frustration lingered like a storm in the back of her mind. She thought about her journey, the years of hard work, the grueling training, the countless hours spent learning how to survive in the vacuum of space. She thought about the obstacles she had overcome to reach the heights she had attained. And yet here she was being reduced to a mere figure in a courtroom, a woman in the eyes of the law, just like anyone else, no more special than the person standing next to her, waiting to be fined for something small and insignificant. Tanya didn't want to make a scene, but the injustice of it felt too great to ignore. She stepped forward, slowly moving to the center of the room where she could see the judge's face. Clearly his back was still turned as he dealt with other matters. The crowd was distracted and unaware of what was unfolding in the corner of the room. But Tanya couldn't keep quiet any longer. She raised her hand to get his attention. "Excuse me, Judge Reynolds," she said, her voice calm, but firm and steady as it cut through the murmurs in the room. The judge turned his head toward her, and his eyes narrowed slightly as though he had been jolted from his routine. He adjusted his glasses and gave her a questioning look, but Tanya didn't wait for him to speak. She stepped closer to the bench, holding out the envelope for him to take. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity that made the judge's expression falter. Judge Reynolds blinked a few times, clearly caught off guard by her sudden boldness. He reached for the envelope, but he didn't take it right away. His fingers hovered above it for a moment, and Tanya could see the uncertainty flicker in his gaze. He hesitated before slowly taking the envelope from her hands. He opened it without saying a word, and began reading the papers inside. The silence in the room stretched as every eye turned toward the exchange. The moment stretched on, but it felt like hours. Tanya's heart raced as the judge read through the documents. The room was deathly quiet. No one knew what was happening. They didn't know the full story, but Tanya felt every second of it, like a weight pressing on her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her ground. The judge's face slowly changed as he read the words, his brow furrowing as realization began to dawn on him. His eyes flicked between the papers and her face, and the pieces started to fall into place. Finally, he looked up from the papers, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something akin to shock. "Miss Thompson." He started, his voice softer than before. "I had no idea," he said almost to himself, before he met her gaze, his voice growing steadier as he continued, I had no idea you were." Tanya nodded slowly, her face unwavering. She didn't need to hear the rest of his sentence. She knew where he was going with it. And she didn't need his apology, not yet, not while she still had something to prove, something more important than the fine or the mistake he had made. Judge Reynolds set the papers down on the bench, his hands shaking slightly, as though he had just been hit with a realization too big to process. In an instant, the room remained silent, the tension thick and palpable, every eye in the courtroom trained on the interaction. Tanya stood still, her face composed. Though her heart was racing, she knew the significance of this moment, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or overlooked based on assumptions made about them by people in positions of power. Judge Reynolds swallowed hard and cleared his throat. He seemed to be struggling with what to say next. His eyes flicked nervously toward the gallery before returning to her. "Miss Thompson, I must apologize," he began, his voice uncertain, the usual confidence stripped away as he spoke clearly, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I had no idea you were an astronaut." Tanya didn't flinch, her gaze still steady. As she met his eyes, she could feel the weight of his words, but she wasn't sure they meant anything. She wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't looking for him to regret his decision. She was looking for recognition, real recognition, the kind that comes when someone sees you for who you truly are, beyond the labels, beyond the surface of the moment, beyond the rush to judge. The judge continued, stammering through his words, the embarrassment on his face evident. He seemed like a man who had been caught off guard by something much bigger than he was prepared for, but Tanya didn't need him to unravel in front of her. She had heard enough of those apologies over the years, from people who hadn't seen her worth in the first place. His remorse didn't change the fact that she had been dismissed, just like everyone else who didn't fit the mold of what he expected her to be. "I know this must be awkward, but I assure you that this mistake can be corrected. I will make sure your fine is revoked," he said, finally trying to regain some control. Tanya shook her head slowly. She didn't need the fine revoked. It wasn't about the fine anymore. It was about the assumptions that had led to this moment in the first place. It was about the way she had been treated as just another person in a courtroom full of nameless faces. It wasn't just about a traffic violation. It was about how people treated others based on preconceived notions, without ever really knowing who they were. She was done with people seeing her as small or insignificant, done with being another person to be processed through a system that didn't care to look at the whole picture. Her identity was something that mattered, but it seemed like it would always be overlooked unless she made it clear enough for them to understand. Judge Reynolds seemed to catch the shift in her demeanor, his face softening slightly as he realized the weight of her silence. His earlier attempt at an apology didn't feel like enough now, not for her. He finally sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as he glanced down at the papers on his desk. Before looking back up at her, "I understand, Tanya." His voice was quieter now, more respectful, but still tentative. "I understand. But I still must process this mistake as part of the proceedings. I will have to formally withdraw the fine, if that's all right." Tanya didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure she wanted the fine withdrawn, because at that moment it felt like the fine was the least of her problems. The real issue was how quickly people made judgments, and how slowly they corrected them. Once the truth came out, Tanya held her gaze firmly on him for a moment longer, before finally nodding her head, once not because she needed his permission to move forward, but because she realized it wasn't about him anymore. It was about her knowing that she didn't need to explain herself to anyone, especially not someone who had dismissed her so quickly. It was about standing in that courtroom with the quiet strength that had taken her years to cultivate. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat and signaled for the court clerk to begin the paperwork. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words. The crowd remained silent, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. Tanya stood there, a symbol of patience and restraint. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was important. She already knew. As the court clerk began processing the paperwork, Tanya felt the weight of the room shift around her. People were still watching, but it no longer felt like they were waiting for her to crumble or retreat. They were watching because something about this moment was different. Something had changed. She didn't know if it was the judge's realization or her own quiet defiance, but she could feel the shift like a tremor running through the atmosphere. Tanya stood her ground, not out of anger, but out of something deeper, something that had taken years to build, years of being overlooked and underestimated. Now, standing in the courtroom, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for anyone who had ever been ignored because they didn't fit someone else's idea of who they should be. The judge cleared his throat again and shuffled the papers on his desk. As he tried to regain his composure, "Miss Thompson, the fine will be formally withdrawn," he said, finally looking up at her again. Though his tone was softer than before, his earlier sternness replaced by an uncertainty that matched his awkward apology. Tanya nodded, but she didn't speak. She wasn't sure what there was to say, what words could express what she felt right now, what words could undo the years of being judged before being seen, what words could change the way the world treated her and others who shared her experiences. Outside the courtroom, the hustle and bustle of the courthouse continued, but for Tanya it felt like everything had slowed down. The cacophony of voices outside the doors seemed distant and muffled, as if she were in a different world altogether. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears, the beating of a heart that had carried her through so much. The weight of the envelope in her hand was grounding her, reminding her that she was not just the woman in front of the judge. She was someone who had earned her place among the stars, someone who had reached heights most people would never even dream of, but still she had been overlooked by the very system that should have recognized her potential. Tanya felt a flicker of something deep within her. The frustration that had once threatened to overtake her now turned into resolve. She didn't need the world to recognize her, not in the way they thought they should. She didn't need their applause or validation. She had already proven everything to herself. She was who she was, and nothing could change that. The judge's mistake would fade into the background soon enough. It was just a small moment in the grander scheme of things, but what mattered was how she carried herself from here forward, how she moved through the world, despite the dismissals and assumptions. She knew her worth even if no one else did. Judge Reynolds signed the papers and handed them back to the clerk, who filed them away quickly. Tanya turned to leave the courtroom, her footsteps echoing down the hall. As she walked out of the room, where so much had unfolded, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Everything she had set out to do had already been done. She had stood her ground and made sure the world knew she wasn't just another case to be processed. She was Tanya Thompson, and that was all she needed to be. Tanya walked through the courthouse doors, her steps measured and steady. The bright daylight outside felt almost surreal after the intense weight of the courtroom. Everything seemed louder now, the honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the hum of city life. It was also different from the quiet that had filled the courtroom she had left behind. Tanya felt her heart rate slowly return to normal, but the buzz of adrenaline still lingered in her veins. She had faced a moment that threatened to strip her of her dignity, but she had held on to it with everything she had. The fine no longer mattered, but the experience had left its mark. Tanya knew she couldn't just forget what had happened. The way the judge had dismissed her without a second thought, it was something she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about one person or one moment. It was about a system that saw her as less than she was because of her appearance, because of her gender, because of the way people assumed she didn't belong in certain spaces. But she had belonged there all along, and she knew that now more than ever. She stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, weaving through the people who hurried on with their own lives, all of them oblivious to what had just unfolded inside the courthouse. The weight of her identity pressed against her chest again. But this time it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a power, a reminder of who she was and everything she had overcome her mind flicked back to the moment she had first read the documents in the envelope, the ones that had confirmed who she really was, the astronaut credentials that she had worked so hard for, the years of training, the late nights, studying, the physical and mental preparation that had pushed her to the limit. But she had made it, she had succeeded, and yet, in that one moment in that courtroom, she had been reduced to something smaller than her accomplishments. The sting of that dismissal still lingered, but it no longer hurt as much now. It felt like fuel, like a spark that could ignite something bigger, something that would make her journey worth more than just the destination. Tanya knew she couldn't let the world define her by a single moment. She couldn't let them take away the years of sacrifice, the victories, the setbacks, the triumphs that had shaped her into who she was today. As she walked further down the street, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from her colleague at NASA asking how the court case had gone. Tanya smiled slightly. It was a simple message, but it grounded her, reminding her of her purpose, reminding her of the life she had built for herself outside of the world's assumptions, the life where she wasn't just Tanya Thompson, the woman in the courtroom. She was Tanya Thompson, the astronaut, the person who had fought for her place among the stars and had earned every bit of it. She typed a quick response, letting her colleague know it was handled and that she was on her way back to the office. But as she hit send, something shifted in her. Her smile faded slightly as the reality of what she had just experienced began to sink in. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had walked through that courtroom, how many had been dismissed in the same way, how many hadn't had the chance to stand up for themselves, how many had been overlooked by the same system that had nearly overlooked her. Tanya knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about fighting one case or one misunderstanding. It was about challenging the system every day and proving that she belonged, that people like her belonged in spaces they were told they didn't fit into, that their worth was not defined by what others saw on the surface, but by the depth of their abilities and the strength of their resolve. As Tanya continued down the street, she felt a renewed sense of purpose building inside her. The crowds around her bustled with their usual distractions, but she was no longer lost in their noise, no longer a part of it. She was separate now. Her thoughts were clearer than ever before. The judge's dismissive glance still stung, but it wasn't enough to break her. No, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. She had been dismissed by one person, but she wasn't going to let that be the story of her life. That wasn't how she was going to be remembered, not by a judge, not by anyone. The walk to her car felt different now. Every step was a small act of defiance. She had stood her ground in that courtroom, and now she was going to stand her ground in the world she had worked so hard to carve out for herself. Tanya slid into the driver's seat of her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel for a moment as the weight of the day settled around her. But she didn't let it consume her. There was something else. She could feel it bubbling up inside her, the fire to speak up, the fire to show the world who she really was and what she had overcome. The drive back to the NASA office was quiet, the usual city sounds fading into the background. As she focused on the road ahead, she thought about the text she had sent to her colleague and wondered what the response would be. But deep down, she knew it didn't matter. This wasn't about reassurance from others. It was about her own belief in herself, her ability to rise above the judgments, the assumptions, the hurdles people put in her way, and keep pushing forward. Her own identity wasn't something she needed permission to claim. It was hers, and it always had been. As she pulled into the parking lot of the NASA building, Tanya parked her car and sat for a moment. With the engine still running, she closed her eyes for a second to gather her thoughts, to reflect on what had just happened in the courtroom, and to remind herself of the road ahead. She wasn't done here, not by a long shot. Today wasn't just another fight. It was a declaration. It was a reminder to herself and to the world that she wasn't going anywhere. She had work to do. There were missions to complete. There were goals to reach. And she wasn't going to let anyone get in her way. Not now, not ever. Tanya turned off the car and stepped out into the cool air, her heels clicking on the pavement. As she made her way toward the entrance of the building, she could see her colleagues coming and going. Some of them paused to greet her, but Tanya was in a different zone now. She had a purpose in her stride, her thoughts sharp as a blade, focused on the work ahead. She hadn't forgotten what had happened in the courtroom, but it wasn't going to define her. It was just another reminder of why she had to keep pushing forward. Inside the building, she made her way to her office, her footsteps quick as her mind raced with the possibilities, the things she could change, the things she could challenge. She sat at her desk and began to review the mission logs for the upcoming project, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as she delved into the numbers and data. But her mind was also thinking about the bigger picture, about how she could use her position to make an impact beyond the confines of her job, how she could become the voice for others who had been overlooked, like her, who had never been given the chance to show what they were truly capable of. In that moment, Tanya made a vow to herself. She wasn't going to let her story be defined by small moments of dismissal or moments of frustration. She was going to use everything she had to make a lasting change, a change that would help others rise alongside her. Because she wasn't just fighting for her own place in the world, she was fighting for the people who came after her, the ones who needed someone to show them that they too could stand tall and claim their worth. The hours passed quickly as Tanya worked at her desk, the glow of the computer screen reflecting in her glasses, her mind sharp and focused as she sorted through mission details. But underneath her concentration, there was an unrelenting energy building inside her. The weight of what had happened in the courtroom was still with her, but now it felt like a spark of fire that was slowly burning brighter. She could feel it in every keystroke, in every calculation she made. As she worked on the upcoming mission, her mind buzzing with ideas of how to push forward and what changes she could help bring about. Every now and then her thoughts would drift back to the courtroom and the way the judge had looked at her when he realized who she was. His stunned expression had been almost a confirmation of the world's failure to recognize her. Until now he had seen her as just another person, another name on a list, another case to process. But once he had seen the truth, he had been caught off guard. His realization had shaken him. But Tanya wasn't interested in shaking him. She was interested in making sure that no one ever overlooked her again. No one ever made the mistake of dismissing her because of what they thought she was supposed to be. As she scrolled through the files, her phone buzzed on her desk. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her colleague David, who had been with her through some of the most challenging parts of her journey. Tanya, she typed, I heard what happened in the courtroom. Don't let it get to you. You know who you are. And that's all that matters. Tanya smiled at his words, but something in her stirred. Was a small comfort. But it wasn't the kind of reassurance she was looking for. She didn't need people to tell her she was capable. She already knew she didn't need validation from anyone else. She had spent so many years proving that she was worthy to be where she was. But there was still a part of her that wondered how many others felt like her, how many had been pushed to the margins and never given a chance to show their worth. David's message lingered in her mind as she continued her work, and it reminded her that she wasn't alone. She had built a network of people who believed in her, who saw her as more than just her accomplishments, but as someone who could make a difference. And that thought ignited something in her. She wasn't just going to work in silence anymore. She wasn't going to let her achievements be overlooked or hidden in the shadows. She was going to speak up. She was going to use her voice, her position, her power to help bring the change that she had always wanted to see. She pushed back from her desk and stood up, her body stretched as she walked across the office to the windows, looking out over the city. Below, the skyline stretched far ahead of her, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the potential that still lay ahead. She felt the pull of the universe. In that moment, the infinite possibilities that awaited her beyond the stars and beyond the courtroom, the realization that she wasn't just bound by the limits that others placed on her, but by the boundless space of her own ambition, her own desire to rise higher, to challenge the expectations, to break through the barriers that others tried to set for her. She turned back to her desk and grabbed her phone once more, staring at the screen as she typed a message to David telling him that she appreciated his support, but that she had work to do, work that went beyond the walls of the office, work that would shape the future in ways that mattered more than just one moment of dismissal. She hit send and felt a small surge of power surge through her veins. Her journey was just beginning. The fight for recognition wasn't over, but she was ready to keep pushing forward, ready to make her mark, not just in the world of space exploration, but in the world itself. As the night settled in, Tanya knew one thing for certain: the future was hers to shape. And no one could take that from her, she had already claimed it. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and mission preparations. But Tanya's mind kept returning to the courtroom, and the quiet determination she had felt in that moment. The world outside seemed to keep moving at its usual pace. But for her, everything had shifted. She had felt something crack inside her, a realization that she had been holding back for too long. She had always been driven by a desire to prove herself, to show the world that she belonged, but now she was done with proving anything to anyone. She was done with waiting for permission to take up space, done with feeling like she had to justify her place in the room. It wasn't about defiance or rebellion. It was about claiming her truth, about standing firmly in the person she had always been, about taking ownership of the work she had done, the sacrifices she had made, the risks she had taken to get to this point. Tanya no longer cared if others recognized her not in the way they expected her to be recognized. She had been to the stars and back. She had faced danger and challenge. She had been through things most people would never understand. And that alone was enough for her. She no longer needed the world to see her as anything other than who she was. As she sat at her desk preparing for the upcoming mission, she found herself thinking about the judge again, about how quickly he had underestimated her, how quickly the system had ignored her, and how many others had suffered the same fate, how many had been treated as less than they were simply because of the assumptions people made about them. She wondered how many more times this would happen, how many more times the world would see people through the lens of their own limited views, and how many more people would be shut out because they didn't fit into someone else's idea of what success looked like. Tanya leaned back in her chair and stared at the wall for a moment, the soft hum of the office filling the silence around her. She wasn't going to sit in silence anymore. She wasn't going to let this injustice slide. She had a voice, and she was going to use it to make sure others didn't have to fight the same battles she had fought, that they didn't have to prove their worth over and over again just to be seen. She wasn't going to wait for change. She was going to create it. Her phone buzzed once again, breaking her train of thought. It was a message from David asking if she had seen the latest news about a mission launch scheduled for the following month. Tanya grabbed her phone and typed a quick reply, letting him know she had seen it and that it was going to be an important mission. But her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't just focused on the technical details of the launch anymore. Her thoughts were consumed by the bigger picture, the work she still had to do, the ways in which she could influence the field of space exploration. And beyond, she wasn't just a scientist, an astronaut, a woman in a male-dominated field. She was someone who could shape the future for others who came after her. Tanya grabbed a notebook from her desk and began writing down ideas for future initiatives. She could start programs that encouraged young women and people of color to pursue careers in science and space exploration, mentoring programs that gave them the support they needed to succeed. The more she wrote, the clearer her vision became. She wasn't just going to wait for others to recognize her. She was going to help create a world where recognition didn't have to be earned through struggle, where everyone had the same opportunities to rise to their potential without facing barriers based on their identity. As the hours passed, she worked steadily, filling page after page with her ideas and plans. She knew there was still much to do, much to fight for. But she also knew that she was no longer alone in this battle. There were others out there who had been waiting for someone to show them the way, to help them believe that they could achieve the same things Tanya had done. And as she looked at the pages in front of her, she realized that this was just the beginning. The following week, Tanya found herself at a crossroads between her work and her vision. The weight of everything she had been planning was beginning to settle in her mind. It wasn't just about one project anymore or one mission. It was about creating a lasting change, a shift in the way people viewed space exploration, and the people who belonged there, not just the astronauts, but everyone who contributed to the field, the engineers, the scientists, the researchers, and especially the young minds who were watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if they too could take part in something greater than themselves. Tanya had spent so much time proving her worth to others that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist, without the need to prove anything. She realized that her strength wasn't just in her accomplishments, but in her ability to lift others, to show them that they too could reach for the stars and make their mark. She no longer cared about the judgments people made. She wasn't interested in earning their approval, because she knew her place in the world, now more than ever before. At the end of the week, she stood in front of a room full of young students at a local community center, a group she had volunteered to speak to about her journey. The room was full of eager faces excited to hear from someone who had gone to space, someone who had accomplished what many would consider impossible. Tanya felt a shift inside her. As she looked out at the group, she had spent years being defined by others. But here in this room, she wasn't defined by anything except her story. She wasn't an astronaut to them. She was simply someone who had a dream and worked hard to make it a reality. As she spoke to the students about her journey, she realized that she had already begun to make the impact she had hoped, for it wasn't just about being a role model for the few who knew her name. It was about reaching the ones who might never know her, but who would be inspired to follow their own paths, to believe in their potential despite the barriers that might try to hold them back. She wasn't just sharing her experiences. She was showing them what was possible if they believed in themselves. After the talk, one of the students, a young girl who had been sitting in the front row, came up to her with tears in her eyes. "I want to be an astronaut too," she said, her voice filled with awe and excitement. Tanya smiled and knelt down to her level, looking into her eyes. "You can do it," she said. "You can be anything you want to be. No one can tell you otherwise. And that's the truth. You have everything inside of you already." The girl smiled back, and Tanya felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced before. It was different from the thrill of a successful mission or the satisfaction of a well-done task. It was a deeper sense of fulfillment, a realization that her purpose wasn't just about achieving great things, it was about giving others the opportunity to achieve theirs too. As she left the community center that day, Tanya felt lighter than she had in a long time. She had found a new sense of clarity. Her mission wasn't just about breaking through the barriers for herself. It was about helping others break through theirs. It wasn't about being the first. It was about creating a world where no one ever had to fight to be seen or heard, where everyone had the chance to rise to their full potential. And she knew that her work had just begun. Tanya sat in her car, staring out the window. As the world moved around her, she had made a difference that day, and she was going to make many more before she was done. But she wasn't in a rush. She knew that every step, every moment of change was going to take time and patience. But she was ready for the journey and more determined than ever to see it through.